Captain Elena Rodriguez stood at attention in the briefing room of Fort McKinney, Montana, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead as Colonel Marcus Webb shuffled through papers on his desk. The mountain air outside was crisp with early morning frost, but inside the room, tension hung thick as smoke. "Rodriguez," Colonel Webb said without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years in the army. "You're being reassigned." Elena's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. At 32, she had earned her captain's bars through grit and determination, flying rescue helicopters in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. She had pulled soldiers from burning vehicles in Afghanistan, rescued hikers from impossible mountain peaks, and never lost a person under her care. "Sir?" she asked, her voice steady. Webb finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with what looked like annoyance. "The Montana State Search and Rescue Unit requested military support for their operations. Apparently, they need someone to babysit weekend warriors who get themselves lost in the wilderness." The insult hit its mark, but Elena didn't flinch. Search and rescue work was exactly what she had trained for, what she lived for, but she knew Webb saw it as punishment duty, something for pilots who couldn't handle real military operations. "The unit is run by a civilian," Webb continued, his tone suggesting this was somehow distasteful. "Tom Bradley. He's been doing this for 15 years. Thinks he knows everything about mountain rescue. He specifically asked for our best pilot." Webb's smile was cold. "I told him you were available." Elena understood the unspoken message. Webb had never liked her, never thought a woman belonged in a cockpit, especially not one who had shown him up more than once during training exercises. This assignment was his way of pushing her aside, putting her somewhere she couldn't embarrass him again. "I'll pack my gear, sir," Elena said simply. "You report to the civilian airfield outside Glacier Falls tomorrow morning," Webb said, already turning back to his papers. "Try not to crash their helicopter, Rodriguez. It's probably all they can afford." The dismissal was clear. Elena saluted crisply, turned on her heel, and walked out of the office. In the hallway, she heard muffled laughter from behind Webb's door. She knew exactly what they were saying, that she was being sent to fly sightseeing tours for lost campers, that she couldn't handle real military work anymore. That evening, Elena packed her few belongings in the small apartment she kept off base. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother Miguel, who was stationed in Germany. "Heard about your new assignment. You okay, sis?" Elena stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "New adventure. I'll be fine." But as she looked out her window at the Montana mountains in the distance, she wondered if this really was the end of her military career as she knew it. Maybe Webb was right. Maybe she was being put out to pasture. The next morning, Elena drove her pickup truck through the winding mountain roads toward Glacier Falls. The town was smaller than she had expected, maybe 3,000 people, with a main street lined with cafes, outdoor gear shops, and a single traffic light that blinked yellow in all directions. The airfield was even smaller, just a single runway with a handful of buildings scattered around it. Elena parked next to a weathered hangar and grabbed her flight bag from the truck bed. Inside the hangar, she found a man in his 50s working on a blue and white helicopter. His hands were stained with grease, and his flannel shirt had seen better days. "This had to be Tom Bradley, you Rodriguez?" he asked without looking up from the engine he was tinkering with. "Captain Rodriguez," she corrected gently. Tom glanced up, taking in her neat uniform and polished boots. His expression was skeptical. "Well, Captain, I hope you can fly better than you can dress for the job. This isn't the parade ground," Elena bit back her first response. "I've been flying rescue operations for 8 years, Mr. Bradley. I think I can handle whatever you need. We'll see." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and walked around the helicopter, giving it a critical look. Is Angel 1. She's not much to look at, but she's saved more lives than I can count. Can you handle a Bell 212? Elena nodded. She had flown dozens of different aircraft, from nimble scouts to heavy-lift transports. "Yes, sir. Don't call me sir. I work for a living." Tom's joke was old and tired, but Elena forced a smile anyway. "The rest of the team will be here in an hour for training. Hope you're ready to learn how real rescue work gets done." The implied insult stung. Elena had risked her life dozens of times pulling people from danger, but apparently that didn't count for much here in Glacier Falls. When the rest of the team arrived, Elena understood why Tom had been so dismissive. The search and rescue unit was made up of volunteers, teachers, shop owners, retirees, people who gave their weekends to help others. They were good people, but they looked at Elena's uniform with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "This is Captain Rodriguez," Tom announced to the group of 8 volunteers. "The Army sent her to help us out." An older man named Frank, who Alina learned was a retired forest ranger, spoke up first. "No offense, Captain, but military flying and civilian rescue are two different things. You folks are used to flying into combat zones. We're trying to bring people home alive." The implication was clear that military pilots were reckless, that they didn't care about saving lives the way civilians did. Alina felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice level. "I've never lost anyone I was sent to rescue," she said. Quietly, "Well," said a woman named Janet, who taught 3rd grade when she wasn't volunteering for rescues. "Let's hope you can keep that record in the real world." Alina spent the rest of the day listening to lectures about mountain weather, about the local terrain, about how to work with ground teams. Everything they told her she already knew, but she listened anyway, taking notes, asking questions, trying to prove that she belonged. That night, alone in the small apartment she had rented above the town's only diner, Alina stared at her reflection. In the bathroom mirror, she looked tired, older than her 32 years. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. But as she brushed her teeth, she thought about all the people she had saved over the years. The young soldier she had pulled from a crashed Humvee in Kandahar. The family of hikers she had rescued from a flash flood in Colorado. The elderly man who had fallen down a cliff while hunting and thought he would die alone in the woods. That she belonged wherever people needed help, and tomorrow she would prove it. Outside her window, the Montana mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, beautiful and dangerous and full of secrets. Somewhere out there, Alina knew someone would soon need rescue, and when that call came, she would be ready, whether Tom Bradley and his team believed in her or not. 3 weeks into her assignment, Alina had settled into an uncomfortable routine in Glacier Falls. Every morning, she arrived at the airfield before dawn to check Angel 1 and review weather reports. The helicopter was older than she was used to, but well maintained, and she was beginning to understand its quirks. The town had been quiet, no major rescues, just a few routine calls. Alina had flown lost hikers out of the wilderness, transported an injured rock climber to the hospital, and helped search for a missing hunter who turned out to be sleeping off a hangover in his truck. Each time, Tom Bradley and his team treated her like a taxi driver rather than a partner. "Just follow our lead," Tom would say before each mission. "We know these mountains better than any outsider ever will." The word outsider always carried extra weight when he said it, and Alina was beginning to understand that it meant more than just being new to the area. She was military, she was from somewhere else, and worst of all, she was a woman trying to do what many of them considered a man's job. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Alina was in the hangar, performing routine maintenance on Angel 1, when the emergency radio crackled to life. "Search and rescue, this is Sheriff's Department. We have a situation at Devil's Canyon. Adult male, rock climbing accident, approximately 200 feet down the north face. He's conscious but injured, can't climb out on his own." Tom Bradley rushed into the hangar, already pulling on his jacket. "Rodriguez, fire her up. We've got a real rescue." Alina's hands moved quickly over the pre-flight checklist. She had performed this routine thousands of times, but her heart rate always picked up when someone's life was on the line. This was why she flew for moments like this. The team assembled quickly. Tom, Frank the retired ranger, Janet the teacher who also served as their medic, and 2 younger men, Pete and Danny, who handled the technical rope work. They climbed into Angel 1 as Alina brought the engines online. "Take us to Devil's Canyon," Tom ordered through the headset, "and keep her steady. This is going to be tricky." Alina lifted off smoothly, the helicopter rising into the crisp mountain air. She knew Devil's Canyon. She had studied every dangerous spot within 100 miles of Glacier Falls. It was a narrow gorge with unpredictable wind patterns and very little room to maneuver. As they approached the canyon, Alina could see the problem immediately. The injured climber was stuck on a narrow ledge about 2/3 of the way down the north face. The canyon walls rose sharply on both sides, creating wind shears that would make hovering extremely difficult. "There," Frank pointed down at the tiny figure on the ledge. "Can you get us down there?" Alina studied the situation carefully. The winds were gusting unpredictably between the canyon walls, and there was barely enough room for Angel 1's rotordisc. But she had flown in tighter spots before, in places where people were shooting at her. "I can hold her steady long enough for you to get him," she said into the headset. "You sure about that?" Tom asked, doubt clear in his voice. "Maybe we should call for a ground team." "That would take hours," Alina replied. "He could bleed out by then." She was already beginning her descent, reading the wind patterns, feeling for the helicopter's response to the canyon's treacherous air currents. Angel 1 shuddered as competing winds grabbed at her rotors, but Elena's hands were steady on the controls. Jesus, Pete muttered. This is crazy. She knows what she's doing, Janet said. And Elena was surprised to hear confidence in the teacher's voice. Elena brought the helicopter down slowly, fighting the canyon winds every foot of the way. The rock walls seemed to close in around them, and she could hear the change in the engine's pitch as the rotors worked harder in the turbulent air. 50 feet above the injured climber, Elena found a narrow column of more stable air and held the helicopter there. I've got him, she announced. Danny, Pete, get your gear ready. The two rope specialists moved efficiently, setting up their rescue system. Elena held Angel 1 rocksteady as they rappelled down to the injured climber, a young man in his 20s who had taken a bad fall and broken his leg. He's secure, came Danny's voice over the radio. Bringing him up. That's when the weather changed. Elena saw it coming, a wall of grey clouds rolling over the canyon rim, bringing wind and the first fat snowflakes of an early winter storm. Tom, she said into the headset, we need to get out of here now. This storm is going to make flying impossible. But even as she spoke, the winds intensified. Angel 1 bucked and twisted as competing air currents slammed into her from different directions. Elena fought the controls, every muscle in her body straining to keep the helicopter steady while Danny and Pete worked to get the injured man secured. Almost got him, Pete called up. Hurry, Elena said through gritted teeth. The helicopter was being thrown around like a toy, and she could feel her arms beginning to shake from the effort of holding her steady. Snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility and making the canyon walls almost invisible. Elena was flying by feel, using the helicopter's instruments and her own experience to keep them from crashing into the rocks. Got him, Danny shouted. We're coming up. Elena held her position for another agonizing minute as the team hauled the injured climber into the helicopter. The moment they were secure, she pulled up sharply, fighting her way out of the canyon just as the storm hit with full force. The flight back to town was a nightmare of swirling snow, zero visibility, and winds that threatened to slam them into the mountains. Elena flew by instruments alone, trusting her training and experience to get them home safely. When Angel 1 finally touched down at the airfield, Elena's hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The injured climber was immediately loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where doctors later said he would make a full recovery. In the hangar afterward, the team stood around in an awkward silence. Elena was coiling her headset cable when Tom Bradley approached her. That was some flying, he said quietly. Elena looked up, expecting to see the usual skepticism in his eyes. Instead, she saw something that might have been respect. Just doing my job, she replied. No, Tom shook his head. That was more than just doing your job. You saved that kid's life today. Frank nodded his agreement. I've been flying in these mountains for 30 years, and I wouldn't have attempted that rescue in those conditions. For the first time since arriving in Glacier Falls, Elena felt like she might actually belong. But the feeling didn't last long. The next morning, she arrived at the airfield to find Colonel Webb waiting for her in his staff car. His face was hard as granite, and Elena knew immediately that something was wrong. Rodriguez, he said as she approached. We need to talk. Elena followed him into the small office attached to the hangar, her mind racing. Had she done something wrong during yesterday's rescue? Had someone complained about her flying? I got a call from the FAA, Webb said, without preamble. Apparently, you flew in conditions yesterday that violated several safety regulations. They're opening an investigation. Elena's heart sank. She had flown in difficult conditions, yes, but well within the limits of what she and the helicopter could handle. Someone had filed a complaint about her flying. Sir, I can explain. No explanations, Webb cut her off. You're grounded pending the investigation. And Rodriguez, he paused at the door. This is exactly what I expected from you. Always pushing too hard. Always thinking you know better than everyone else. As Webb drove away, Elena stood alone in the hangar staring at Angel 1. Yesterday she had saved a man's life. Today she was being punished for it. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of her troubles. The FAA investigation dragged on for 2 weeks, during which Elena was forbidden from flying. She spent her days doing paperwork, cleaning equipment, and watching helplessly as Tom Bradley had to rely on a borrowed helicopter and pilot from the neighboring county for rescue operations. The borrowed pilot, a cocky young man named Rick Morrison, made it clear that he thought the whole situation was Elena's fault. Maybe if you military types learned to follow civilian aviation rules, he said one morning while pre-flighting his helicopter, we wouldn't have these problems. Elena bit her tongue and continued organizing rescue gear. She had learned that Rick was dating Colonel Webb's daughter, which explained a lot about how quickly the FAA complaint had been filed. The investigation finally concluded on a Friday afternoon. Alina was in the hangar when Tom Bradley walked in, holding a official-looking letter. "Good news," he said, though his expression was grim. "The FAA cleared you of any wrongdoing. Turns out the weather conditions were within acceptable limits, and your flying was deemed professionally executed under challenging circumstances." Alina felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So I can fly again, technically." "Yes." Tom handed her the letter. "But there's a problem. The complaint came from someone with connections, and they're not happy about the ruling. Word is, there might be other ways to ground you." That afternoon, Alina got her answer. Colonel Webb arrived at the airfield with new orders. "Rodriguez, you're being transferred back to Fort McKinney immediately. Seems your services are no longer required here." Alina stared at the transfer orders, her heart sinking. She was being pulled back to a desk job, away from the work she loved, away from the team that had finally started to accept her. "Sir, if I could just pack your gear, Captain. You report to my office Monday morning for your new assignment. Supply coordination." Supply coordination, a desk job, shuffling paperwork and inventory reports. Alina felt something break inside her chest. That evening, the search and rescue team gathered at Murphy's Tavern, the town's only bar, for what they called Elena's going-away party. The mood was somber. "This is wrong," Janet said, raising her beer bottle. "You're the best pilot we've ever had." "Politics," Frank muttered. "Same old story. The good ones get pushed out by people who never risked anything for anybody." Alina appreciated their support, but she knew there was nothing any of them could do. She was military, she followed orders, even when those orders were clearly designed to punish her for being too good at her job. "I'll miss flying with you all," she said, meaning it. Tom Bradley had been quiet all evening, nursing his beer and staring out the window at the mountains. Finally, he spoke up. "Alina, can I talk to you outside for a minute?" They stepped out into the cold October air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the mountains loomed like sleeping giants in the darkness. "I want you to know something," Tom said. "I didn't trust you when you first got here. Thought you were just another hotshot military pilot who didn't understand what we do." Alina nodded. She had figured as much, but watching you work these past months, seeing how much you care about the people we rescue, you're one of us now, and what they're doing to you is wrong. "I appreciate that, Tom, I really do, but there's nothing actually." "There might be," Tom interrupted. "I've been making some phone calls. Turns out Rick Morrison has been bragging around town about how his girlfriend's father helped him get rid of the competition. Several people have heard him." Elena's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time someone filed a complaint with the Inspector General's office about Colonel Webb using his position to settle personal scores." Alina considered this. Going after a superior officer was career suicide, even if she had evidence of wrongdoing, but then again her career was already over. "Would you be willing to make a statement?" she asked. "Me and half the town," Tom replied. "That rescue you made at Devil's Canyon. The kid you saved was the mayor's nephew." The mayor's very grateful, and very well connected. For the first time in weeks, Alina felt a spark of hope. The next morning, instead of packing her gear, Alina drove to the county courthouse and filed a formal complaint with the military inspector general's office. The complaint detailed Webb's pattern of discrimination, his connection to Rick Morrison, and the suspicious timing of the FAA investigation. She also did something else. She called her brother Miguel in Germany. "I need a favor," she told him. "Remember that reporter friend of yours from Stars and Stripes, the one who's always looking for stories about military injustice?" 3 days later, Alina was sitting in her small apartment when her phone rang. It was Colonel Webb, and he sounded furious. "Rodriguez, get to my office now." Alina drove to Fort McKinney expecting the worst. Instead, she found Webb sitting behind his desk, looking like a man who had just been told he had terminal cancer. "Sit down," he said quietly. Alina sat, keeping her expression neutral. "It seems," Webb began, his voice carefully controlled, "that there have been some allegations made about my conduct regarding your assignment to the search and rescue unit." Alina said nothing. "The Inspector General is opening an investigation. In the meantime, you're being reassigned to the 442nd Air Rescue Squadron at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Seems they need an experienced helicopter pilot for high-altitude rescue operations." Alina blinked in surprise. The 442nd was one of the most elite rescue units in the military. It was exactly the kind of assignment she had always dreamed of. "There's more," Webb continued, looking like each word was being pulled from him with pliers. Your promotion to major has been approved. Congratulations. Elena stared at him. Sir, apparently, your rescue work in Glacier Falls caught the attention of some very important people. The mayor of Glacier Falls is a personal friend of the governor. The governor is a personal friend of the senator who chairs the Armed Services Committee. The senator made some phone calls. Webb stood up and walked to the window, his back to Elena. You know what the funny thing is, Rodriguez? I always thought you were too emotional, too soft to be a real military pilot. Turns out I was wrong. You're exactly what this service needs. More than I am, apparently. Elena heard something in his voice she had never heard before, respect, and maybe a little fear. Your new assignment starts Monday, Major Rodriguez. As Elena left Webb's office, she realized that sometimes the best revenge wasn't getting even. Sometimes it was just proving that you were better than the people trying to tear you down. But she wasn't done with Glacier Falls yet. There was one more thing she needed to do. Major Elena Rodriguez spent her first 3 months with the 442nd Air Rescue Squadron, proving herself all over again. The unit was based at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls, Montana, just 2 hours from Glacier Falls, and their mission was high-altitude, high-risk rescues throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Her new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, was everything Colonel Webb had not been: professional, fair, and more concerned with getting the job done than with anyone's gender or background. Rodriguez, Mitchell had said on Elena's first day, I've read your file. That rescue at Devil's Canyon was textbook flying under impossible conditions. That's exactly what we do here, except our missions are usually even more dangerous. Elena threw herself into her new role, flying missions that took her to remote mountain peaks, into blizzards that would ground civilian aircraft, and into situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. She loved every minute of it, but she never forgot about Glacier Falls, or about the team that had finally accepted her as one of their own. She kept in touch with Tom Bradley and the others, and when her schedule allowed, she would volunteer for search and rescue operations in the area. It was during one of these volunteer missions, on a bitter cold morning in January, that Elena received the call that would change everything. She was at the Glacier Falls airfield, helping Tom perform maintenance on Angel 1, when the emergency radio crackled to life with unusual urgency. All units, this is Sheriff's Department. We have a major emergency at Mount Glacier. A military transport plane has gone down in heavy snow. 8 souls on board, including the pilot. Last known position was the north face of Mount Glacier, approximately 8,000 feet elevation. Elena and Tom looked at each other in shock. Mount Glacier was the highest and most dangerous peak in the region, a jagged mountain that rose almost 11,000 feet into the sky. In January, it was a death trap of avalanches, whiteout conditions, and temperatures that could kill in minutes. Tom grabbed the radio microphone. Sheriff's Department, this is Glacier Falls Search and Rescue. We're responding. What aircraft? Military transport, twin-engine turboprop. They were en route from Malmstrom to Hill Air Force Base when they encountered severe weather and went off radar. The Air Force is sending their own rescue teams, but they won't arrive for at least 4 hours due to the storm conditions. Elena's blood ran cold. 4 hours was too long. If anyone had survived the crash, they wouldn't last that long in the brutal conditions on Mount Glacier. Tom, she said quietly, I know that flight path. They would have been following the eastern approach to avoid the worst of the weather. If they went down on the north face, I know. Tom's face was grim. It's a death sentence. Nobody can survive up there in this weather. The radio crackled again. All units be advised. The downed aircraft is a VIP transport. Passengers include Senator William Hayes, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and several high-ranking military officers. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Senator Hayes, the same senator who had intervened on her behalf months ago, whose phone calls had rescued her career and exposed Colonel Webb's corruption. Tom, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her, I have to try. Tom looked out at the swirling snow and shook his head. Elena, it's suicide. The winds up there are gusting to 60 miles per hour, visibility is 0, and even if you could find them, there's nowhere to land. Then I'll have to find another way. Within minutes, the rest of the search and rescue team had assembled at the airfield. Frank, Janet, Pete, and Danny all looked at the weather conditions, and came to the same conclusion Tom had reached. We can't fly in this, Frank said bluntly. The helicopter would be torn apart by the wind shear. Maybe if we wait for the storm to pass, double quotes, Janet suggested. They'll be dead by then, Elena replied. If they're not already. She was already. pulling on her flight suit, running through emergency procedures in her mind. She had flown in conditions almost this bad before, but never at altitude, never in terrain this dangerous. Alina, Tom said, putting a hand on her shoulder, you don't owe these people anything. Yes, the senator helped you out, but that doesn't mean you have to throw your life away. Alina paused in her preparations and looked at him steadily. It's not about owing anyone anything, Tom. There are 8 people up there who are going to die if someone doesn't help them. That's all I need to know. She turned to the rest of the team. I need volunteers for a ground support team. If I can find them and get them stabilized, we'll need people positioned to help with evacuation once the weather clears. Without hesitation, the entire team stepped forward. We're with you, Janet said simply. Alina felt a surge of emotion that she quickly pushed down. She needed to focus on the mission now. As she performed her pre-flight checks on Angel 1, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell from the 442nd. Rodriguez, I just heard about the crash. Stand down. We're launching a full rescue operation as soon as weather permits. With respect, ma'am, by then it will be too late. Major, that's an order. The conditions are beyond the limits of safe flight operations. Alina looked out at the swirling snow, at the mountain that rose like a white monster in the distance. Mitchell was right. This was beyond the limits of safe flight operations. It was probably beyond the limits of any flight operations. Understood. Colonel, she said into the phone, Rodriguez out. She turned off her phone and finished her pre-flight check. Tom appeared at her elbow. What did the Air Force say? They said to wait for backup, and Alina climbed into the pilot's seat and began starting Angel 1's engines. I've never been very good at following orders that don't make sense. As the helicopter's rotors began to turn, cutting through the howling wind, Alina thought about all the people who had doubted her over the years. Colonel Webb, who thought she was too emotional to be a real pilot. Rick Morrison, who thought military pilots were reckless cowboys. Even some of her own team members, who had initially seen her as an outsider who didn't understand real rescue work. Maybe they were right about the reckless part. What she was about to attempt was probably insane. But 8 people were counting on someone being just crazy enough to try. Alina pulled up on the collective, and Angel 1 lifted off into the storm. Flight to Mount Glacier was the most challenging of Alina's career. Angel 1 bucked and fought against winds that seemed determined to tear her apart, while snow reduced visibility to mere feet. Alina flew by instruments and instinct, following the terrain she had memorized during countless training flights. She climbed toward the mountain's north face. The conditions only worsened. Ice began forming on the helicopter's rotors, and the engine temperature gauges climbed dangerously high as the systems worked overtime to keep them airborne. Alina, talk to me, came Tom's voice over the radio from the ground support position they had established at the base of the mountain. Still climbing, Alina replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. Approaching 8,000 feet. No visual on the crash site yet. She had been searching for 20 minutes, when she finally spotted something that didn't belong on the mountainside, a dark scar in the snow, where the aircraft had carved a path through the trees before coming to rest on a narrow ledge. I've got them, she announced over the radio. The aircraft is intact but positioned on a ledge about 50 feet below the ridgeline. I can see movement near the wreckage. What she didn't say was that the ledge looked barely wide enough to hold the crashed plane, and one wrong move could send the entire wreckage tumbling another 1,000 feet down the mountain. Alina circled the crash site, studying the terrain and wind patterns. There was no way to land. The ledge was too narrow, and the winds were too unpredictable. But there might be another option. She keyed her radio to contact the survivors directly on the emergency frequency. Crashed aircraft. This is search and rescue helicopter overhead. Do you copy? A weak voice crackled back through the static. This is Senator Hayes. We copy. We have 2 critically injured, 6 others in various states. We're running out of time here. Alina's mind raced through her options. A traditional rope rescue would be impossible in these conditions. The winds would slam anyone hanging from a line into the mountainside. But there was one other possibility, something she had trained for but never attempted in conditions this severe. Senator, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to attempt an emergency evacuation using a rescue basket, but I need your people to do exactly what I tell them. Understood. Alina positioned Angel 1 about 30 feet above the crash site, fighting the helicopter's controls as mountain winds tried to slam her into the rocks. She lowered the rescue basket on its cable, watching as it swung wildly in the turbulent air. The first person they brought up was one of the critically injured, a young Air Force officer who had taken shrapnel from the crash. Alina's hands, never wavered on the controls as she held the helicopter steady while the basket was loaded and raised. One by one, she evacuated the survivors. Each lift was a battle against the elements, requiring every ounce of skill and experience Alina had developed over her career. Her arms ached from fighting the controls. Sweat poured down her face despite the freezing temperatures, and ice continued to build up on the helicopter's surfaces. Senator Hayes was the last to be evacuated. As the rescue basket brought him up to the helicopter, Alina could see that he was injured but conscious. When he was safely inside, he leaned forward toward the cockpit. "Major Rodriguez," he said, recognizing her name from the nameplate on her flight suit. "I remember you. You're the pilot who exposed that corruption at Fort McKinney." "Yes, sir," Alina replied, not taking her eyes off her instruments as she began the treacherous flight back to safety. "Well, Major, it seems I owe you my life now, as well as my gratitude." The flight back to Glacier Falls was only slightly less harrowing than the rescue itself. Angel 1 was operating at the very limits of her capabilities, and Alina knew that any system failure now would mean disaster for everyone on board. But Angel 1 held together, and Alina brought her passengers home safely. As the helicopter touched down at the airfield, ambulances were waiting to transport the injured to the hospital. The storm was finally beginning to clear, and Alina could see Air Force rescue helicopters approaching in the distance. The backup that had arrived just as she was finishing the job. That as Alina shut down Angel 1's engines, her hands were shaking. From exhaustion and adrenaline, she had just completed one of the most difficult rescues in aviation history, and everyone was alive. Tom Bradley was the first person to reach her as she climbed out of the helicopter. His face was a mixture of relief, admiration, and something that might have been awe. "Alina," he said quietly, "that was the most incredible flying I've ever seen." But Alina wasn't done yet. As the medical teams worked on the survivors, she noticed that one of the Air Force officers who had been on the crashed plane was making phone calls. She recognized him as Colonel James Park, someone she had worked with briefly at her previous assignment. An hour later, as Alina was giving her report to the investigating officers, Colonel Park approached her. "Major Rodriguez," he said, "I need to tell you something. The flight we were on today, it wasn't a routine transport mission." Alina looked at him questioningly. "We were carrying evidence to Washington. Evidence about a network of corruption in the military aviation community." Colonel Webb's case was just the tip of the iceberg. Alina felt her pulse quicken. What kind of evidence? Financial records, communications, witness statements. Turns out Webb was part of a larger scheme to manipulate pilot assignments and aircraft procurements for personal gain. Several high-ranking officers are involved, including some who tried to have you transferred or grounded when you started asking the right questions. Alina thought back to all the obstacles that had been placed in her path, all the people who had tried to undermine her career. It was starting to make sense. "The crash today," Park continued, "it might not have been accidental. We were flying a route that should have been safe, but someone provided us with outdated weather information. Someone who knew we were carrying evidence that could destroy their careers." Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air.